On May 2, 1995, 15-year-old Kiplyn Davis walked into Spanish Fork High School in Utah for what would be the last time anyone would see her alive. She attended her morning classes, laughed with friends in the cafeteria during lunch, and then simply vanished into thin air. Her purse, her makeup, her dental retainer, her school books, everything she owned was still locked away in her locker. She never made it to her afternoon classes. She never came home. And for 16 years, nobody knew what happened to her, until one of her classmates finally admitted to a crime so disturbing that even today, he refuses to tell the whole truth. The morning of May 2nd hadn't started well for Kiplyn. She'd gotten into an argument with her parents, Richard and Tamara Davis, before leaving for school. We don't know exactly what the argument was about, but it was significant enough that Kiplyn arrived at school early that day, perhaps to clear her head or just to get away from the tension at home. Despite the rough morning, she seemed to go through her routine normally. She showed up to her first period class, then her second, then her third. Friends saw her in the cafeteria at lunchtime, chatting and eating like it was any other Tuesday. But then something changed. Kiplyn didn't show up for her fourth period class. She didn't show up for fifth period either. One close friend later said he'd spoken with her between fourth and fifth period, but he would eventually change that story, which immediately raises questions about what he really knew. Other friends would later tell investigators that Kiplyn had mentioned she wouldn't be attending activities planned for that evening. Even more troubling, she'd apparently told people it would be better if she just ran away. Was she planning something? Was she meeting someone? Or did someone take advantage of a vulnerable teenage girl who'd had a bad morning? When Kiplyn didn't come home at her usual time after school, her parents reported her missing. The initial response treated it as a possible runaway situation. After all, she'd had that argument with her parents that morning, and she'd mentioned running away to friends. But her family knew something was terribly wrong. Kiplyn had left everything behind. Her belongings were still at school. A teenager running away doesn't leave without her purse, without her makeup, without anything. Within 2 months, the FBI got involved and began treating the case as a possible kidnapping. As the months dragged on without any sign of Kiplyn, the investigation took a darker turn. Police began to suspect foul play. Rumors started circulating around Spanish Fork, the kind of whispers that spread through small communities when something terrible happens. People claimed her body was buried in a nearby canyon. Others said it was hidden in a train tunnel. Some insisted she was buried under a building. The rumors were everywhere, but Kiplyn was nowhere. 4 years after her disappearance, in 1999, her family held a memorial service. They put up a marker with her name at the Spanish Fork City Cemetery, a gravestone for a girl whose body they'd never found. The case went cold, but it never went away. In 2003, 8 years after Kiplyn vanished, U.S. Attorney Paul Warner decided to revive the investigation. This time, they had a focus. The investigation zeroed in on several of Kiplyn's classmates, young men who'd been at school that day, who'd known Kiplyn, and who seemed to know more than they were saying. The names that kept coming up were Timmy Brent Olsen, Christopher Neil Jepson, Rucker Leifson, Gary Blackmore, and Scott Brunson. Timmy Brent Olsen became the primary suspect almost immediately. During interviews with law enforcement, his story kept changing. He gave dramatically different accounts of when he'd last seen Kiplyn. He provided 2 completely different alibis for where he was when she disappeared. When someone's story keeps changing, it's usually because they're hiding something. But it got worse. Multiple witnesses came forward with statements claiming that Olsen had confessed to them. According to these witnesses, Olsen had admitted to sexually assaulting Kiplyn Davis, killing her and hiding her body in a canyon near the Spanish Fork River. The picture that emerged of Timmy Olsen was deeply disturbing. During the investigation, at least 4 different women testified that Olsen had been sexually aggressive toward them or had committed sexual assault against them. This wasn't just about Kiplyn anymore. This was about a pattern of predatory behavior. Investigators believed they had their man, but proving it would be another matter entirely. Without a body, without physical evidence, they needed confessions, they needed testimony, and they needed people to tell the truth. The legal proceedings that followed were complicated and drawn out. Olsen and Leifson were both charged with Kiplyn's murder. Christopher Neil Jepson was also charged, but in May 2009, prosecutors made a decision. Rather than seek the death penalty against Jepson, they dropped the murder charges. Jepson pleaded no contest to obstruction-related charges and signed an affidavit stating he didn't know the circumstances or cause of Kiplyn's disappearance. Was this the truth, or was it a legal maneuver? We may never know. Rucker Leifson pleaded guilty to lying to a grand jury and was sentenced to 4 years in prison. Gary Blackmore and Scott Brunson were also found guilty of lying to a grand jury. Their sentences were tied to whether they would testify against Olson. The web of lies was unraveling, but slowly, painfully slowly. These were people who'd known what happened to Kiplyn, or at least knew parts of the story, and they'd kept quiet for years while her family suffered, not knowing if their daughter was alive or dead. In June 2009, there was a hearing on a motion to dismiss the murder charge against Olson. The judge deferred his ruling, saying he hadn't heard all the evidence from prosecutors yet. The case hung in limbo, this terrible uncertainty stretching on and on. But the pressure was building, the evidence was mounting, and perhaps most importantly, the weight of what he'd done was finally becoming too much for Timmy Olson to carry. On February 11, 2011, nearly 16 years after Kiplyn Davis disappeared, Timmy Brent Olson pleaded guilty to manslaughter. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison. But even in his guilty plea, even in his admission of involvement, Olson couldn't tell the whole truth. His story was that he'd seen another individual hit Kiplyn in the head with a rock. He claimed he'd only helped move her body afterward. He refused to name this other person. He refused to say who had actually killed her. And here's where the story becomes even more frustrating and heartbreaking. Olson admitted that he helped move and bury Kiplyn's body, but he absolutely refused to tell authorities where she was buried. Think about that for a moment. He confessed to being involved in disposing of a 15-year-old girl's body. He went to prison for it, but he wouldn't give her. Olson became eligible for parole in 2021. The parole board had a decision to make. Here was a man who'd served his time, who'd been a model prisoner perhaps, but who still refused to cooperate, who still refused to tell a grieving family where their daughter's remains were located. The parole board denied his release. They made it clear that his refusal to disclose Kiplyn's location was a factor in their decision. He's now scheduled to serve his entire sentence and won't be released until February 2026. The question that haunts this case is why? Why won't Olson tell the truth? If his story is accurate, if someone else killed Kiplyn and he only helped dispose of the body, why protect that person? Is he afraid of retaliation? Is he protecting someone he cares about? Or is the truth something different entirely? Many people believe Olson's story about another person is a lie, that he's the one who killed Kiplyn, and revealing the location of her body would prove his guilt beyond any doubt. Maybe there's evidence with her remains that would contradict his version of events. Kiplyn's family has lived with this nightmare for nearly 3 decades now. Her parents, Richard and Tamara, have had to endure not just the loss of their daughter, but the cruel uncertainty of not knowing where she is. Kiplyn had a younger sister, Carissa Lords, who was born in 1986. Carissa was only 9 years old when her sister disappeared. She's grown up in the shadow of this tragedy, in a family forever marked by loss and unanswered questions. The case has been featured in multiple true crime documentaries and podcasts over the years. The investigation discovery series Nightmare Next Door did an episode called Stealing Beauty about Kiplyn's disappearance. The popular Crime Junkie podcast covered her case in an episode titled Missing Kiplyn Davis. YouTube creator Danelle Hallen also made a video about what really happened. Each retelling keeps Kiplyn's story alive, keeps pressure on those who know the truth, and reminds the public that this case, while technically solved, is far from over. Kiplyn Davis would be 45 years old today if she'd lived. She'd potentially be married, maybe have children of her own. She might have pursued a career, traveled the world, experienced all the joys and sorrows that make up a human life. Instead, her life was cut short at 15, and her body remains hidden somewhere in the Utah landscape, known only to the man who put her there, and possibly to others who've kept that terrible secret. The Polyclass Foundation, an organization dedicated to finding missing children, features Kiplyn as one of their cases. Even though we know she's deceased, even though someone was convicted in her death, she's still technically a missing person because her remains have never been recovered. It's a strange legal and emotional limbo, the state of knowing someone is dead, but not being able to prove it with physical evidence, not being able to hold a funeral with a body present, not being able to visit a grave and leave flowers. There's something particularly cruel about cases like this, where families know their loved one is gone but can't bring them home. It denies them closure, though that word feels inadequate for the magnitude of what they're experiencing. It's not just about closure. It's about dignity, about giving Kiplyn a proper resting place, about having somewhere physical to go to remember her and mourn her. Timmy Olsen has taken that away from them, and he continues to take it away from them every day he refuses to speak. Some people wonder if Olsen will ever tell the truth. Will he have a change of heart as he gets older? Will guilt finally overwhelm him? Will he decide, perhaps on his deathbed, to finally give the Davis family the information they need? Or will he take the secret to his grave, leaving Kiplyn's location unknown forever? These are questions without answers, and they add another layer of torture to an already unbearable situation. The town of Spanish Fork has never forgotten Kiplyn Davis. Her case is part of the community's history now, a reminder of how quickly a normal day can turn into a nightmare, how someone can be there one moment and gone the next. Spanish Fork High School, where Kiplyn spent her last morning, continues to educate students, but her memory lingers there. Every year, new students learn about the girl who disappeared from their school, and perhaps some of them look at the faces around them and wonder who among them might know something they're not saying. What happened in that school, or shortly after Kiplyn left it on May 2, 1995, remains partially shrouded in mystery. We know she was alive at lunch. We know she didn't make it to her afternoon classes. We know that Timmy Olsen and possibly others were involved in her death and the disposal of her body. But the exact sequence of events, the precise location where she died, the full list of everyone involved, these details remain locked away in the minds of people who've chosen silence over truth. For Richard and Tamara Davis, the fight continues. They've never stopped advocating for their daughter, never stopped pushing for answers, never stopped hoping that someone will finally tell them where Kiplyn is. They've had to watch as the man who admitted to burying their daughter walks around a prison yard, eats meals, sleeps in a bed, lives a life, while their daughter lies in an unmarked grave somewhere, alone and forgotten by everyone except those who loved her. That's all for today. Don't forget to subscribe and be kind to each other.